The medieval understanding of menstruation represented one of the most complex intersections of religious doctrine, medical theory, and social control in European history. Far from being viewed as a natural biological process, menstruation was perceived through a lens of moral judgment, spiritual contamination, and physical danger that profoundly shaped the lives of women for centuries. This perception was not merely a product of ignorance, but rather a sophisticated system of beliefs that drew upon classical medical texts, biblical interpretations, and folk traditions to create a comprehensive worldview that positioned menstruating women as fundamentally different from and potentially dangerous to the rest of society. The foundation of medieval attitudes toward menstruation can be traced to several influential sources, each contributing to a complex web of beliefs that would persist well beyond the medieval period. Classical medical theory, primarily derived from the works of Galen and Hippocrates, provided what was considered scientific justification for viewing menstruation as a pathological condition. According to these ancient authorities, women were naturally colder and moister than men, creating an imbalance in their bodily humors that necessitated the monthly purging of corrupted blood. This medical framework suggested that menstrual blood was not merely different from regular blood, but was actively harmful and toxic to the body. Religious doctrine added another layer of complexity to medieval understanding of menstruation. The Old Testament, particularly the Book of Leviticus, provided explicit instructions regarding the ritual impurity of menstruating women, declaring them unclean for 7 days and requiring purification rituals before they could rejoin normal social and religious activities. Early Christian theologians, including influential figures such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, interpreted these biblical passages within the context of medieval theology, creating a framework that viewed menstruation as a consequence of original sin and a reminder of women's spiritual inferiority. The convergence of medical and religious thought created a powerful intellectual foundation for viewing menstruation as fundamentally problematic. Medieval scholars argued that the monthly flow of blood was evidence of women's inherently flawed nature, a physical manifestation of their moral and spiritual weakness. This interpretation was supported by what appeared to be empirical observation. Women did indeed experience monthly bleeding. They did sometimes appear weakened during this time, and various negative outcomes could be correlated with menstrual periods through selective observation and confirmation bias. Folk beliefs and popular culture further reinforced these learned perspectives, creating a comprehensive social understanding that penetrated all levels of medieval society. Rural communities developed elaborate systems of taboos and restrictions surrounding menstruating women, often going far beyond what religious doctrine actually required. These folk beliefs frequently portrayed menstrual blood as possessing supernatural powers, capable of curdling milk, withering crops, rusting metal, and causing various forms of harm to people, animals, and objects that came into contact with it. The practical implications of these beliefs were far-reaching and profound. Menstruating women were routinely excluded from religious services, prohibited from entering churches, and forbidden from participating in various sacraments. They were often required to avoid food preparation, particularly bread making and dairy processing, based on the belief that their touch could spoil or contaminate food products. In many communities, menstruating women were expected to avoid gardens and agricultural areas, as their presence was thought to be harmful to growing plants. Medical practitioners of the medieval period incorporated these beliefs into their understanding of human health and disease. Physicians routinely advised patients to avoid contact with menstruating women, particularly during times of illness or vulnerability. The medical literature of the period is filled with warnings about the dangers of menstrual blood, including claims that it could cause madness, blindness, and various other ailments in those exposed to it. These medical beliefs were not merely theoretical, but had practical consequences for how healthcare was provided and how medical emergencies were managed. The social isolation imposed upon menstruating women was both systematic and pervasive. In many medieval communities, special arrangements were made to accommodate the regular exclusion of women during their menstrual periods. Some households maintained separate sleeping areas or even separate buildings where women could be isolated during menstruation. Larger communities sometimes established communal spaces specifically for this purpose, creating institutionalized systems of segregation that reinforced the belief that menstruation was both shameful and dangerous. The economic implications of menstrual taboos were also significant. Women who worked in various trades and crafts found their earning capacity regularly interrupted by menstrual restrictions. Female merchants, artisans, and laborers had to navigate complex systems of belief and practice that limited their ability to participate fully in economic life. This economic disadvantage was not merely an unintended consequence of religious and medical beliefs, but was often explicitly justified as necessary for protecting society from the harmful effects of menstrual contamination. Educational and intellectual opportunities for women were similarly constrained by menstrual beliefs. The regular exclusion of women from religious and educational spaces due to menstruation contributed to broader patterns of female exclusion from scholarly and intellectual life. While other factors certainly contributed to women's limited access to education, the monthly interruptions caused by menstrual taboos created additional barriers that reinforced existing gender hierarchies and limitations. The legal system of medieval Europe also incorporated menstrual beliefs into its framework of justice and social order. Legal codes sometimes explicitly address the status of menstruating women, particularly in relation to their ability to serve as witnesses, participate in legal proceedings, or exercise various legal rights. While the specific provisions varied across different legal traditions and time periods, the general principle that menstruation affected women's legal capacity was widely accepted and institutionalized. These beliefs about menstruation were not static, but evolved throughout the medieval period in response to changing theological, medical, and social conditions. The rise of scholastic theology in the later medieval period led to more sophisticated and systematic discussions of menstruation within religious and philosophical frameworks. Medical knowledge also evolved, though often in directions that reinforced rather than challenged existing prejudices about menstrual blood and its supposed dangers. The persistence and pervasiveness of negative attitudes toward menstruation in medieval Europe reflected broader patterns of gender relations and social control. The monthly occurrence of menstruation provided a regular opportunity for reinforcing women's subordinate status and justifying their exclusion from various forms of social, economic, and religious participation. The complexity and sophistication of anti-menstrual beliefs also demonstrates the intellectual energy that medieval thinkers devoted to constructing and maintaining systems of gender hierarchy and control. The theological foundations of medieval menstrual beliefs were deeply rooted in Christian interpretations of biblical texts, patristic writings, and scholastic philosophy that collectively created a comprehensive religious framework for understanding female biology. The primary scriptural foundation for these beliefs came from the Mosaic Law, as outlined in Leviticus, which designated menstruating women as ritually impure and required specific purification procedures before they could rejoin religious and social activities. Medieval theologians did not simply accept these passages at face value, but developed sophisticated interpretative frameworks that connected menstrual impurity to broader theological concepts, including original sin, gender hierarchy, and spiritual contamination. St. Augustine, whose influence on medieval Christianity cannot be overstated, contributed significantly to the theological understanding of menstruation through his writings on sexuality, sin, and gender. Augustine's interpretation of the fall narrative in Genesis led him to view various aspects of female biology, including menstruation, as consequences of humanity's corrupted state. He argued that menstruation was among the physical manifestations of spiritual disorder that resulted from Adam and Eve's disobedience, positioning monthly bleeding not as a natural biological function, but as a reminder of human sinfulness and divine judgment. Thomas Aquinas further developed these theological perspectives through his systematic approach to Christian doctrine and Aristotelian philosophy. In his extensive writings, Aquinas addressed menstruation within the context of his broader understanding of gender, reproduction, and human nature. He argued that women's monthly bleeding was evidence of their inherently defective nature, a physical manifestation of their failure to achieve the perfection represented by male physiology. This interpretation provided what appeared to be philosophical justification for viewing menstruation as problematic, while connecting these views to respected intellectual traditions. The concept of ritual purity played a central role in medieval Christian understanding of menstruation. Medieval theologians developed elaborate systems for determining when women were ritually clean or unclean, drawing upon both biblical precedents and contemporary theological reasoning. These systems extended far beyond the simple 7-day period mentioned in Leviticus to include complex calculations based on the duration and intensity of menstrual flow, the woman's age and health status, and various other factors that were thought to influence the degree of contamination involved. Medieval canon law, which governed many aspects of daily life in Christian Europe, incorporated these theological perspectives into legally binding regulations that affected women's participation in religious life. The most significant of these regulations involved the exclusion of menstruating women from churches, the prohibition against receiving communion during menstruation, and restrictions on women's ability to participate in various religious ceremonies and sacraments. These legal provisions were not merely theoretical, but were actively enforced by church authorities and had real consequences for women's spiritual and social lives. The sacramental theology of medieval Christianity also reflected and reinforced negative attitudes toward menstruation. The doctrine of transubstantiation, which held that bread and wine were literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ during the Eucharist, created particular concerns about menstrual contamination. Theologians worried that menstruating women might somehow corrupt or defile the sacred elements, leading to strict prohibitions against women's participation in communion during their periods. Similar concerns affected other sacraments, including baptism, confirmation, and marriage, creating comprehensive systems of religious exclusion based on menstrual status. Monastic communities developed their own distinctive approaches to managing menstruation within religious settings. Female monastic communities had to develop practical solutions for maintaining religious observance while accommodating the biological realities of their members' lives. Some convents established separate prayer areas for menstruating nuns, while others developed modified liturgical practices that allowed continued participation in religious life without violating theological prohibitions. These adaptations reveal the tension between theological theory and practical necessity that characterized many aspects of medieval religious life. The cult of the Virgin Mary presented medieval theologians with particular challenges regarding menstruation and female purity. The doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity and sinlessness raised complex questions about whether she had experienced menstruation, as this biological function was associated with both sexuality and spiritual contamination. Various theological solutions were proposed, including arguments that Mary had never menstruated due to her unique spiritual status, or that her menstruation had been somehow purified and made holy through divine intervention. These debates reveal the fundamental tension between the veneration of feminine sanctity and the denigration of female biology that characterized medieval Christianity. Pilgrimage traditions and practices also reflected menstrual taboos and restrictions. Women planning religious pilgrimages had to carefully time their journeys to avoid traveling or visiting sacred sites during their menstrual periods. Pilgrimage guides and religious authorities provided detailed instructions for women regarding the proper management of menstruation during religious travel. Some pilgrimage sites maintained separate accommodations for menstruating women, while others prohibited their entry entirely. These practices created additional barriers for women's religious participation and reinforced the association between menstruation and spiritual contamination. The medieval understanding of sin and purification was closely connected to beliefs about menstrual contamination. Theologians argued that menstrual blood carried not only physical impurity, but spiritual contamination that could affect others through various forms of contact or proximity. This belief led to the development of elaborate purification rituals that went far beyond the biblical requirements, including special prayers, ceremonial washings, and waiting periods that extended well beyond the cessation of menstrual flow. Medieval hagiography and saints' lives also reflected contemporary attitudes toward menstruation. Female saints were often portrayed as having transcended normal biological functions, including menstruation, through their spiritual perfection. Stories of holy women who never menstruated or whose menstruation ceased upon entering religious life serve to reinforce the association between sanctity and the absence of female biological functions. Conversely, stories of saints who suffered from menstrual disorders or unusual bleeding often interpreted these conditions as forms of divine testing or spiritual purification. The relationship between menstruation and demonic influence was another significant aspect of medieval theological thought. Some theologians argued that menstruating women were particularly vulnerable to demonic temptation and possession, while others suggested that menstrual blood itself could be used in various forms of witchcraft and magic. These beliefs connected menstruation to broader concerns about female spirituality and the perceived greater susceptibility of women to supernatural corruption and evil influences. Theological discussions of menstruation also intersected with medieval understanding of marriage and sexuality. The temporary sexual prohibitions associated with menstruation were incorporated into broader theological frameworks regarding the proper conduct of married life and the moral regulation of sexual activity. These discussions often emphasize the pollution aspects of menstrual blood while also addressing the practical challenges that menstrual taboos created for married couples attempting to fulfill their religious and social obligations. The influence of these theological perspectives extended far beyond formal religious settings to shape popular culture and everyday life throughout medieval Europe. Folk religious practices incorporated and often amplified official theological positions regarding menstruation, creating local traditions and customs that sometimes exceeded church requirements in their strictness and scope. These popular religious expressions demonstrate the deep penetration of theological ideas about menstruation into all levels of medieval society. The practical implementation of menstrual taboos in daily medieval life created a complex web of social restrictions, economic limitations, and survival strategies that profoundly shaped women's experiences and life opportunities. These restrictions were not merely theoretical religious or medical concepts, but were actively enforced through various mechanisms of social control that operated at every level of medieval society. Understanding the practical dimensions of medieval menstrual beliefs requires examining how these ideas translated into specific behaviors, institutions, and social arrangements that governed women's daily lives. Domestic life in medieval households was significantly structured around menstrual taboos and the practical challenges they created. The monthly exclusion of women from normal household activities necessitated complex arrangements for managing essential domestic tasks, including food preparation, childcare, and household maintenance. Many families developed rotating systems where other female relatives, servants, or neighbors would temporarily assume the responsibilities normally carried out by menstruating women. These arrangements required extensive planning and coordination, as households had to anticipate and prepare for the regular absence of key members. The impact on food production and preparation was particularly significant given the central role that women played in medieval food systems. The prohibition against menstruating women handling bread, dairy products, and other foodstuffs created practical challenges that required innovative solutions. Some households maintained separate cooking areas or equipment specifically for use during menstrual periods, while others relied entirely on alternative arrangements during these times. The economic cost of these restrictions was substantial, as households often had to purchase prepared foods or hire additional help to maintain normal operations during women's menstrual periods. Agricultural communities faced unique challenges in managing menstrual taboos given the intensive labor requirements of farming and and the seasonal nature of agricultural work. The belief that menstruating women could damage crops or livestock created serious practical problems during critical periods of planting, harvesting, and animal husbandry. Rural communities developed various strategies for managing these challenges, including the use of substitute labor, the temporary relocation of menstruating women, and the development of specialized roles that could be performed by women regardless of their menstrual status. Urban artisan communities and trade guilds also had to accommodate menstrual restrictions within their professional structures. Women who worked in various crafts, including textile production, brewing, and food preparation, found their earning capacity regularly interrupted by menstrual taboos. Some guilds developed formal policies regarding menstruation and work, while others relied on informal arrangements between members. The economic impact of these restrictions was often severe for women who depended on regular work for their survival, creating additional vulnerabilities and dependencies within urban economic systems. The management of menstrual hygiene itself presented enormous practical challenges given the limited resources and technologies available to medieval women. The absence of manufactured hygiene products meant that women had to rely on improvised solutions using available materials, including cloth rags, wool, moss, and other absorbent substances. These materials had to be carefully managed, cleaned, and reused, creating additional labor and resource requirements that were often difficult to meet. The lack of privacy and sanitation facilities made menstrual hygiene particularly challenging, especially for women living in crowded conditions or traveling away from home. Travel and mobility were significantly constrained by menstrual taboos and practical hygiene challenges. Women planning journeys had to carefully consider the timing of their menstrual cycles and make arrangements for managing hygiene and social restrictions while away from home. Pilgrimage routes and accommodations sometimes included special provisions for menstruating women, though these were often inadequate or expensive. The difficulties of managing menstruation while traveling created additional barriers to women's mobility and participation in various forms of economic and social activity that required movement between communities. Educational opportunities for women were severely limited by menstrual restrictions that excluded them from schools, libraries, and other centers of learning on a regular basis. The monthly interruption of educational activities made it difficult for women to pursue sustained intellectual development, while the association between menstruation and contamination reinforced broader prejudices against female intellectual capacity. Some educational institutions developed alternative arrangements for female students during menstruation, though these were often inadequate and reinforced rather than challenged existing patterns of exclusion. Healthcare and medical treatment were also complicated by menstrual beliefs and taboos. Menstruating women were often excluded from hospitals and other medical facilities, while female healers and midwives faced restrictions on their ability to practice during their menstrual periods. The medical understanding of menstruation as pathological and dangerous led to treatments and interventions that were often harmful or counterproductive. Women seeking medical care had to navigate complex systems of belief and practice that often prioritized religious and social concerns over actual health needs. Legal proceedings and civic participation were affected by menstrual beliefs that questioned women's capacity to serve as reliable witnesses or participants during their periods. Some legal systems explicitly addressed the menstrual status of female witnesses, while others incorporated these considerations into broader assessments of women's credibility and legal capacity. The regular exclusion of women from legal proceedings during menstruation created additional barriers to their participation in civic life and their ability to protect their interests within legal systems. The psychological and emotional impact of menstrual taboos was profound and lasting. The monthly experience of exclusion, contamination beliefs, and social isolation created significant stress and anxiety for many women. The internalization of negative beliefs about menstruation affected women's self-perception and confidence, while the practical challenges of managing menstrual restrictions created ongoing sources of worry and concern. Some women developed coping strategies, including the cultivation of supportive relationships with other women, the creation of alternative social spaces during menstruation, and the development of personal practices for maintaining dignity and self-respect despite social marginalization. Social networks and community relationships were both strained and strengthened by menstrual practices. The regular exclusion of women from normal social activities disrupted community bonds and limited women's ability to participate fully in social life. However, the shared experience of menstrual restrictions also created opportunities for solidarity and mutual support among women. Some communities developed informal networks for providing assistance during menstruation, including childcare, food preparation, and emotional support. Economic stratification significantly influenced how menstrual taboos were experienced and managed. Wealthy women had access to better hygiene materials, private spaces for managing menstruation, and servants who could assume their responsibilities during menstrual periods. Poor women faced much more severe challenges, often lacking basic materials for hygiene management and having no alternatives for maintaining their economic activities during menstruation. These class differences in menstrual experiences reinforced broader patterns of social inequality and created additional vulnerabilities for women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. The long-term consequences of medieval menstrual beliefs extended far beyond the medieval period itself, creating lasting patterns of gender inequality and discrimination that persisted well into the modern era. The systematic exclusion of women from various forms of social, economic, and intellectual participation based on menstrual beliefs established precedents and institutional structures that continued to limit women's opportunities long after the specific religious and medical beliefs that justified them had been abandoned or modified. Understanding these historical patterns provides important context for comprehending the persistence of menstrual stigma and its continued impact on women's lives and opportunities in contemporary society. The medieval period's approach to menstruation thus represents not merely a historical curiosity, but a foundational chapter in the long history of using female biology as a basis for social control and gender discrimination. The sophistication and comprehensiveness of medieval menstrual taboos demonstrate the intellectual energy and social resources that were devoted to maintaining systems of gender hierarchy, while the practical implementation of these beliefs reveals their real-world impact on millions of women over centuries of European history.